Good morning. You know, change is a constant, right? And some of the previous speakers have been talking about, especially with NASA, the way they are changing to adapt to all the commercialization in our market. So military, DoD, that domain is also changing rapidly. And its change is really being influenced by a lot of the innovation and the rapid innovation that's happening in the commercial sector. So this is going to be a really good panel with some diverse perspectives on how that change is affecting ConOps, acquisitions, things like that. So I'm excited to moderate this panel. And we're going to open it with just a short video just to kind of pique your curiosity a little bit about some of the change and to maybe have you think in different ways about how maybe the change in our space industry is affecting your business. The past decade of rapid enterprise change has enabled new markets and new business models to emerge in the space enterprise. Disruptive development of systems for proliferated LEO have enabled many new opportunities for satellite services, facilitated rapid prototyping and the use of space as a testbed for technology insertion, and encouraged the infusion of non-traditional space-qualified parts and components to meet aggressive technology demonstration schedules. New LEO launch providers are creating increased opportunities to access space through multi-manifest and ride-sharing scenarios, new pricing models for launch vehicles that lower the cost per kilogram for access to low Earth orbit. Forecasted future space operations and changing business models have shifted the view of space from just a destination to a utility that facilitates on-orbit servicing operations and logistics, additive and in-space manufacturing, and even mining for resources in space. As the pace of technology accelerates, many government agencies are taking advantage of other transactional authority contracting to rapidly access emerging commercial technology and bring the product development velocity of the private sector to government acquisition. Are you prepared for this wave of change? So this panel is comprised of Dr. Joel Mozer, Dr. Andrea Harrington, and Ron Faith. And they'll all give you their perspective on this change from their view of the world. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joel Mozer.
So the next great power contest in space will be won by NewSpace. Let me say that again. The next great power contest will be won by NewSpace. Now, I'm the Chief Scientist, Air Force Space Command. You probably thought I was going to talk about something a little else. Maybe something about science and technology in space. Maybe something about how space has become contested and congested. Or maybe how space is now a warfighting domain. Or something about the new Space Force. I'm really here to talk about something much bigger than all of those things. It's really about national power and prestige and leadership, and quite honestly, national survival. So maybe you don't think about great power competition every day, so you may not understand the gravity of my opening thesis statement. A great power is a nation state that can exert its influence around the globe. A superpower is a dominant great power. It's a power that can really exert its influence around the globe. Now, and beyond, as I'll talk about, and you may get the wrong impression of this graphic. This is not about military dominance per se. Think about these ships and these aircraft as different elements of national power, including economic and political and technical leadership. And they're all headed in the same direction in a very impressive formation. National power is that way. Let me put this picture in another context. The famous naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan stated that power projection by benevolent nations guarantees freedom and commerce for the world. Abrogation of this responsibility would leave the world open for tyranny. This was true for the maritime domain, and it will be equally true for the domain of space. So one characteristic of great powers is that they have a national grand strategy. So grand strategy is the long-term orchestration of power and commitments to secure national interest in a world where war is possible. Ideally, all national policies and strategies and actions should be taken with grand strategy in account, especially on the global stage. So again, many of you may not think about this, but the grand strategy in the United States has been remarkably stable. It's been the same since World War II. So long before the fall of the Soviet Union, we established a grand strategy of leadership and primacy. Those are the two key terms. And there's really four pillars of the US grand strategy. The first is to be military dominant, which is one thing. Number two is to support our allies. Number three is to integrate other players and countries into US institutions and markets. And the fourth is to limit the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So I want you to think about those and note that each of those extends seamlessly into space. And again, I don't think we talk enough about grand strategy. It rarely comes up in political debates. Even our presidential candidates don't really talk too much about it. And I don't want to get into why that is, but it really should be the basis of our national actions. And it turns out it really is the basis of our national defense strategy. So the 2018 National Defense Strategy, or NDS, highlights three elements that describe a global scenario like none we've ever seen before. The first is the return of great power competition, which I just talked a little bit about. Second is the exponentially increasing rate of technological change, and the third is the global access to technology. So the NDS acknowledges that our competitive military advantage has been eroding and that the increasingly complex global security environment characterized by overt challenges to the free, open, and international order. So the president has really confirmed that this year that space is a part of hard power national security. Space Policy Directive 4, which was signed earlier this year, refers to space as a warfighting domain. It establishes the Unified Combatant Command, United States Space Command. And it calls for the creation of a Space Force. Both of those things are sort of happening as I speak. However, as I said, great power is really extends beyond military power. It relates to other elements of national power, including economics, a rules-based order, and global influence. So, as all of you are well aware, with respect to economics, space is a $300 billion a year enterprise. It's expected to grow 10 or 100-fold to possibly $30 trillion by the year 2035, at least according to the Department of Commerce. So that's a big deal. With respect to a rules-based order, a lot of the international law and treaties are based on the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And a lot of the international law is yet to be built in space. I think we had a question about that earlier. And a lot of the norms and international behaviors are yet to be established. And my co-panelist, Dr. Harrington, is an expert on these things. I'll let her talk about that. But as this group will attest, perhaps more than any other, in the next few decades, the persistent sphere of human influence is likely to extend well beyond the planet Earth. We'll possibly have hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of people living, working, and touring off-planet. So because of these changes on national power, it's critical that the US and like-minded allies come up with a vision of the future. And envision that future in such a way that the actions and plans that they take between now and then drive us towards that future. And that's across our military, civilian organizations, as well as the intelligence community, for that sake. So this is where NewSpace comes in. The role of NewSpace industrialist is critically important in our national grand strategy. It's the entrepreneurs and visionaries, such as the folks here today, that will be responsible for making the expansion into space sustainable by building the infrastructure, creating the markets, and populating the settlements in the future. So gone are the days when the government drove all innovation in space. We've kind of turned the corner. where the past investments in programs like Apollo and Corona and GPS and Atlas and Delta, those now provide in the new space industrialist a basis of growing, innovating, and sustaining our presence in space. It's that new space community that are taking the technologies to the next level, and it'll be you guys that take it to the level after that. So the National Defense Strategy really talks about this. It talks about the increasing rate of change of technology. This is clear today with the ongoing race in space, military race in space. Our primacy is being challenged by China and Russia through the development of anti-satellite weapons, jammers, kinetic effects, and other technologies. Of course, the U.S. is responding in a predictable way according to our national grand strategy by trying to make our military systems more resilient and defendable. However, if we fail here and we fail our grand strategy, it's a national imperative. We fail our grand strategy, so it's a national imperative to win this space race. And technology really holds this into balance. For example, if China becomes militarily dominant in space, so for example, if they can hold our GPS systems at risk, that fundamentally changes conflict in the South China Sea. Hypothetically, if Russia can deny our communications, surveillance, and other space systems through either cyber or electronic jamming or kinetic effects, it would alter the dynamics of their encroachment into a NATO country. So in short, technology really has the potential to affect this national power on a global scale. It can prevent us from being able to exert our influence, and it can also provide other states the ability to exert influence on us. So interestingly, the entanglement of these national interests will extend to the moon soon. China has a national plan not only to explore the moon, but to put Chinese settlers on the surface and exploit the resources of the moon. The Chinese national goal is to be the technologically dominant global power by the 2040s. China's reach, in a military sense, will extend to the moon and possibly beyond. From a national defense strategy perspective, we must ensure that we have the technology to surpass China's reach. If we don't, they will occupy the military high ground and decide sovereign interactions on their own. So as I noted earlier, technology is developing rapidly. Falling launch costs, increasing miniaturization are opening up space to a whole new set of applications. And those applications will drive new technology, which will drive new applications. And that's how the exponential rate of change happens. It builds upon itself. And it's happening today in space. So again, as this audience understands, much of that tech is being designed outside of the defense establishment. The military, although we still have unique needs, we don't drive that technology space alone, but we're also a recipient of commercial developments. The important point is that we in the government must pay close attention to the new technologies and look for ways that we can use them for defense and extending our reach. We also must be alert to the vulnerabilities and threats that are represented by these new technologies. This is going to become more and more difficult as time goes on. So as Thomas Friedman said in his book, Thank You for Being Late, society may have already reached the point where the rate of change has exceeded society's ability to deal with it. So I have an example of that. So just a month or so ago, SpaceX launched their first 60 satellites as part of their Starlink constellation in low Earth orbit. That really challenged our space surveillance network. We had trouble tracking so many satellites that are slowly dispersing. But more than that, that deployment triggered all kinds of reports of UFOs and alien attacks, and you probably saw some of those pictures. And it really evoked the displeasure of the astronomy community because of the light pollution that it created. And we're just at the beginning of this large constellations in LEO. SpaceX goal is not 60 satellites, but 12,000. In fact, the FCC, there's lots of competitors wanting to do that too. The FCC has approved almost 20,000 such satellites in low Earth orbit. We're just starting to cope with the implications of those 60. We have no idea what the second and third tier, second order consequences of such a constellation might be. Think back about how technologies that have offered so much promise, such as the NSF net and the ARPANET back in the 80s, When I was a college student, the NSF-Net connected just a small handful of research institutions across the country. But did anybody ever anticipate that 38 years later that the internet would have such a global impact? Really, did they anticipate the impact of a $3 trillion a year digital marketplace and the cybercrime and the instant deployment of deepfake videos around the globe that's enabled by the internet? I don't think so. So looking forward, are we anticipating those second and third order consequences of space? Some of these things will fundamentally challenge the future. So here's the problem. As Time magazine reporter Stuart Brand once wrote, change that is too rapid can be deeply divisive. If only an elite can keep up, the rest of us will grow increasingly mystified about how the world works. This has potentially grave implications for the military. If our leaders and decision makers don't understand the entanglement and the consequences of the technology and their actions, they may give up trying. If that happens, the unintended consequences can be grave indeed. So what does this mean for space? Two things come to my mind. The first one is this new technology may drive new modes of warfare. Think about how the nuclear bomb changed the mode of warfare. We went from conventional warfare to thinking about mutual assured destruction and deterrence. Given the dramatic potential of space, those modes of warfare could change very quickly in the future, in the rapid acceleration. The other thing I think about is with this increasing technology, especially in the area of autonomy and autonomous systems for military operational systems, that might be implemented in space first, partly because of the enormous distances involved in space, and second, because there's not really a lot of humans in space, at least not yet. So how will that future human out-of-the-loop warfare play out in space? That's a big deal. So I'd like to touch briefly on the last element of the National Defense Strategy. They talked about the fact that technology spreads around the world more quickly than ever before. And you can see in this chart on the left the rate of increase in the number of countries joining the investment in space. And then along the right you can see Asia, the Russians, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the former Soviet Union, Europe, Latin America, North America, and Middle East, North Africa. And you can see we're still a big player in this, but the other groups are growing. The NDS states that the drive to develop new technologies is relentless, expanding to more actors with lower barriers of entry and moving at accelerating speed. New commercial technology will change society and ultimately the character of war. That fact that many technological developments will come from the commercial sector means that state competitors and non-state actors will have access to them, a fact that risks eroding the conventional overmatch to which our nation has grown accustomed. That's a big deal. The NDS goes on to warn that maintaining the department's technological advantage will require change to industry, culture, investment sources, and protection across the national security innovation base. In short, it's important that the U.S. new space industry thrive in this global marketplace. It's crucial that the U.S. put in place the policies and infrastructure to encourage new space and that the military be prepared to defend future commerce and human presence in space. Anything less will lead us to losing ground with respect to the other countries. So let me conclude by repeating my opening statement. The next great power contest will be won by new space. I'm very hopeful that through meetings like this one, we will start that dialogue between new space industry and the government. And we need to work together to find solutions that implement this grand strategy. It may not be something you think about on a daily basis from a business sense, but it's something that's very powerful for the nation. And finally, I'd like to, I'm very gratified that this new space era is capturing the hearts and minds of the nation. Early last year, I got to go to the first Falcon Heavy launch, the one where Elon put his Tesla into deep space. I got to invite my son. He was 24 years old at the time, and he works outside of the aerospace industry, but he was treated like a rock star by his co-workers back in Ohio because he got to go to this launch. It was really cool. And as we drove out that day, the beaches were lined with spectators. The roads were just completely jam-packed for people wanting to see that launch. And after the launch, the crowd just spontaneously broke out into a chant of USA. that's really heartwarming, and it's great to know that the embers are still alive with the American public about space. And we need to fan those embers. Not only is it cool to think about space, as I've just described, it's critical for our national survival. So it's very important that the nation puts meetings like this one in the bigger context and gives developments in NewSpace the gravity and attention that they deserve. It's difficult to argue that space will not be a significant element of the next great power competition. This is a serious attention and deserves the full attention of the United States government plus industry. Our future really depends on it. Thank you very much.
Kind of sobering, right? To get that perspective on our national power and how the commercial infrastructure, new space infrastructure, not can enable, needs to enable our superiority or continuing superiority or the fight that we're in with nation states like China and Russia. Next we'll have Ron Faith, who's the president and COO of RBC Systems.
Thank you. It's great to be with you here this morning. First of all, when I was in graduate school at the University of Washington, I used to do research for Boeing Aerospace and Defense, and we used to come down here to the Kent Valley to do that work. So returning down here is always fun. So what we wanted to do is provide a little bit of a perspective from a NewSpace company, how the changes that are going on in the defense industry, and in particular in the Air Force and space, is impacting and how we're working and integrating into it. What are the nature of the opportunities and what are the nature of the mechanisms by which new space companies can work and collaborate with the government. Let's see if I get this right. There we go. So to begin with, first a little bit about RBC Signals. So we are a venture-backed startup. We are headquartered just up the road in Redmond, Washington. We've raised about a little less than $3 million to date in seed capital. If there are any venture folks in the room, we are out raising our Series A right now, so happy to talk with you afterwards. We were founded in June of 2015, and so we're about 4 years into this endeavor. And basically the opportunity that we identified as a new space company that was as we were going to go from roughly 1,500 satellites to tens of thousands of satellites that were going up, every one of those satellites need to be able to talk to the ground in some way, shape, or form. And that while there has been great revolution going on in launch, enabling prices to come down and more satellites to go up, and while there has been a great revolution that's gone on in satellite manufacturing, where these satellites become more and more capable of doing new and greater things, that we had not seen to date a revolution in what's gone on in satellite communications, in particular in communicating with the ground. That traditionally, you would have a satellite dish that would be built, it'd be single purpose, mission built in many ways. It's expensive and quite frankly massively underutilized. In fact, it may only be utilized for something on the order of 4 to 8% of the day in terms of its capacity and ability to be used. So what we went out is to go out and then change the landscape of that accordingly. How does that relate to the needs in the world of defense? So those very changes that have brought up down the cost of launch and have made small satellites more capable has shifted the mindset, in particular with the Air Force and space, going from large, exquisite assets out in geostationary orbit to increasingly exploring how they can use smaller satellites in constellations or in small groups in low Earth orbit or mid Earth orbit, in some cases all the way out to GEO, and allowing them to have faster turns, greater innovation, and quite frankly, less targets that are easy to destroy or incapacitate. Okay, and so as a result, the needs of the Space Force and the Air Force has increased dramatically in the need to be able to adopt many of the things that are going on in NewSpace. So, as Joel mentioned, one of the great changes that happened in just the past couple of years is that space is recognized as a contested domain by our national defense infrastructure. And that's an important sea change in mindset, because that requires all sorts of new ways of thinking about things in terms of assets that we have up there, how we protect those assets, and how we think about the offensive capabilities as well in that domain. At the same time, and again, as Joel had mentioned, that what's going on is most of that innovation is going on outside of the traditional defense establishment. And so there's this real need for how do you bring, especially a large number of US companies such as RBC Signals that are bringing this innovation into the commercial world and segue it into the ability for the defense establishment to take advantage of that. And so that's one of the things we've done. I'm going to talk about specific mechanisms and programs that we're taking advantage of that the Air Force and other branches of the military have brought forth. But as you think about these new contested domains, there's a need for increased resiliency. So again, the traditional exquisite, very expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars of geostationary assets that are out there are vulnerable. And it's very expensive to try to harden them to potential threats to them. And so by going with many more smaller satellites, you potentially go to a more resilient posture that's harder to take out or in some cases deprecate. Well, that's also the case in the ground segment, that if you have a concentration of assets on the ground for communicating, that's a problem. Because if everything's on one island in northern Norway, for example, that might be near the Russian border, you want to have a diversification of assets so that the enemy has to take out many, many locations, or you have the ability to fail over into other capabilities. The other issue is that once you go to low Earth orbit satellites and smaller satellites, you're not continuously pointing and talking to one point on the ground. You have something flying around the Earth roughly every 90 minutes. As a result, you can have latency issues in terms of how quickly you can establish communications back with that satellite, unless you have global reach to a number of dishes around the world in order to talk to. And finally, one of the other areas here that ends up being important, as you're putting up more space-based assets, one of the most important byproducts of all that is data. It's intelligence, it's signal intelligence, it's a whole range of things. And so the ability to digest that data, process that data, and get increasingly larger amounts of data to the ground becomes critically important, and you need the infrastructure to be able to do that. So what we've done is we've gone out, we've got over 70 antennas in over 40 locations around the world that we, so we do that in a hybrid network where some of them, about 10 to 15% of them, we own and operate ourselves. And the rest of them are partners, such as we made an announcement with AWS Ground last week, where their antennas are now available in our network. And so depending on the SLA level and the need, we provide the ability to have flexible capability both on a subscription basis and for more dedicated assets, or on a buy the drink, or as you want to use it if you need flexible capacity for bringing data down to the ground. Okay, that we do this through a highly automated fashion with APIs so that it's programmatically possible. You'll notice that we do have a large number of partner antennas in Russia and China. As you can imagine, the Air Force does not take advantage of those. But they do take advantage of, for example, we've got fabulous assets in Alaska and other places where we're building some things out, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The reason for this is to provide a low-cost infrastructure as opposed to the traditional way that's doing it, and then also to have these ground stations be software-defined ground stations, so they're highly configurable. And you want that so that they're both multi-tenant and multi-mission. And that way you get the utilization rate of those antennas up, and you get the overall cost per pass down for all parties associated with it. Okay, and so we've seen dramatic growth in this. To give you an idea, we just started with our government business a little over a year ago, and in part with that, as well as some other customers and the increase in NewSpace, we're going to quadruple our revenues this year over what we did last year, and we're not alone in the ground segment space. So we're seeing tremendous growth across the board in these areas. So the programs that the Air Force and others that have put in place that have been fabulous for small companies and startups to be able to work with are as follows. One is the SBIR program, SBIR. And so these are grants in phased stages that allow small businesses to come in and partner and work hand in hand with sponsors within the government. In our case, we were awarded our first SBIR this past year, where we're taking cloud compute infrastructure, and such as an Azure Stack or an AWS Outpost, and we're placing that in the ground stations themselves as part of a distributed compute environment where some of the compute is going to be done on board on satellites. Some of the compute is going to be done in cloud environments on the back end, such as AWS or Azure, and some of it will be performed at the ground stations. So that similar to what you might see with edge compute capability with like an Akamai or something like that, so that you can optimize where you want all this data processed and have a data processing pipeline that goes all the way out to the edge and all the way back to the cloud. Second is the DIU. And so the Defense Innovation Unit is doing some great projects there. We're involved in a project that's doing a situational awareness deployment with them globally. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on is that there can be a great impedance mismatch between startups and working with the government. Just getting the acronyms down alone is challenging. In fact, between all the acronyms in space and then all the acronyms with the military, I often feel that I'm in conversations where it's all acronyms, and then every once in a while there's an English word in the middle of them as you're going through it. And so accelerators and folks such as Decode or Techstars or the Catalyst group in Colorado Springs are doing a fabulous job, and I would encourage you as a NewSpace company to engage with them and work with them. Thank you.
So now we'll have Dr. Andrea Harrington, and she'll give her perspective, which is a little bit unique from the first two speakers.
Good morning, everyone. So I am here to talk to you about space education in the defense industry, and a little bit also about space law, which is my area of expertise and focus. I'm the director of the Schriever Scholars program, which is the first focused space IDE program, or concentration, rather. We've been told not to use the word program because it has different accreditation rules that go with it. So we're the concentration for space in IDE, which is intermediate developmental education for military professionals. So just to give you, I guess my disclaimer got eaten, but I'm going to give you the disclaimer to say that my views that I express here and my opinions that I express here are those of my personal views and opinions as an individual academic, not the views and opinions of the Air Force or Air University or the Department of Defense. So what we're going to talk about today is setting the stage for how our program came to be, how the Schriever Scholars concentration came to be, and how it fits within the Joint Professional Military Education system, why it was created, why it's important, and how that fits into the changing winds in the defense industry. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about space law and the future of defense space from a legal perspective. But first I want to give a little anecdote or a little thought that I had last week while I was traveling with some of my ACSC colleagues. And we went to the museum down at Fort Rucker as part of this trip, and I was reading through all of the different milestones and looking at all of the different airplanes in the museum, and thinking about the fact that 1903 was the first heavier-than-air powered aircraft flight that happened. And then in 1969, we are now in the midst of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission when we landed humans on the moon. So if you think about it, and I had never thought about it in this context on this timeline, 66 years between the very first heavier-than-air aircraft powered flight and when we put human beings on the moon. That's a rapid pace of technological change. One lifetime. The reason I put this together is that there were some slides hanging in the museum about a particular inventor who had lived through the entire development of aviation and then space flight through the Apollo landings. And I thought, that is one person's lifetime. You could be born and be old enough to remember the first powered flight and the first human landing on the moon. And I think that context is really important for us looking forward as the space industry continues to develop and we look at what is possible in such an incredibly short time frame. So if we look at contextualizing the Schriever Scholars concentration and how it came to be and why education matters for military space professionals, we had proposed legislation in 2016 and 2017 for a Space Corps, and this is not the first time that a Space Corps or a Space Force had been discussed. It had been a topic of discussion back in 2001, in fact, but for recent memory, we're looking at that proposal that was a proposal between two representatives, one Democratic, one Republican, and that did not make it through the Senate, though it did make it through the House. Subsequently, we had the executive branch announcements calling for a Space Force and the SPD-4, which Dr. Mozer mentioned, calling for the establishment, the stand-up of U.S. Space Command, and also calling for the Space Force creation as well. There are current legislative proposals being worked on that deal with the Space Force. Some of them look, or one of the two of them looks a little bit more like the Space Corps proposal from a couple of years ago. So these are all in play right now. And these are all in play right now because there's been a lot of criticism, whether it's right or wrong, as to how the Air Force has handled space. Space acquisitions, training and education, promotion of space professionals in the space industry, and what that means for our participation in the great power competition that Dr. Mozer stated going forward. How are we going to compete in space if we don't step up our ability to deal with defense space activities? And so all these changes are going on the government side. Well, these changes are also coming through on the education side. So our concentration was created to fit within ACSC. So ACSC, Air Command and Staff College, is the in-residence education master's degree in military master's program for Air Force officers as well as officers from our sister services and international partners. So we've got just under 500 students a year that come through on this core curriculum here that includes core classes in leadership, war theory, international security, air power, and joint warfighting. They also take electives and have an opportunity to participate in research task forces. Well, for Schriever Scholars, Air Force Space Command wanted to bring in a concentration that was really going to prepare space professionals moving forward in a way that was not being done as part of the ACSC core curriculum, with a purpose, and that's a short quote from our MOA, to develop strategic space leaders. So we're looking at strategic space thinkers, the kind of people who are going to be able to engage in the great power competition that Dr. Mozer mentioned. And so our missions as the Schriever Scholars faculty are to run the Schriever Scholars concentration for the 13 students annually that are going through our program and really give them the in-depth education that they need, integration of space into the Air Command and Staff College and Air University curriculum, and faculty development and further outreach. So being here is part of the outreach mission that we're engaging in. So the very first class of Schriever Scholars went through the concentration last year. Started in July of 2018 and just graduated in June 2019. We had 11 Air Force officers, 8 space, 1 acquisition, 1 cyber, 1 intelligence, an Army space officer, and a naval flight officer to make up our 13 last year. Instead of air power, they studied 2 core courses in Space Power 1 and Space Power 2, looking at the history of space power, the theory and application of space power, and developing space strategy. They also went through a course called Space Horizons, which was taught by my colleague, who's sitting in the audience right in front here, who has since retired, Pete Garrettson, and contested domain instead of taking those electives, so they could get that specialized knowledge and learn how to think about space. And Space Horizons really focused on the future, talking about all of the issues that are coming up as commerce continues to grow in space, what the defense mission is to protect that commerce, and even things like asteroid mining that are really being developed now as we speak, even though we're not mining asteroids yet. They also undertook an in-depth research project and traveled to meet space leaders in Washington, D.C., have tours of ULA and MDA, and participate in the Space Symposium and the Schriever War Game to really immerse for that educational experience. The research topics that were all proposed by the students, and I put a list of them up, I'm not going to read through them all, but you can get a sense of the really forward-thinking, broader idea of space that the students are getting coming out of this program as compared to when people are coming into the program, or as compared to folks that you might talk about that have worked on the defense side in space. And in fact, one of these papers, written about the mind of space, the culture of space in the military. How do we think about space? What is our mission? How do we develop? Are we there to support the warfighter? Are we there to support the warfighter and do a whole lot more, like protect commerce? Does our mission extend only to GEO? Does our mission extend to all of cislunar space? These questions about culture and how we're thinking about our military branch in space are going to be really important moving forward. And that paper actually won the Commandant's Award from ACSC this year. And I think this really points to how people are changing the way they're thinking about space on the military side. The way that space is a very different domain than air. People don't live in the air, they transit through it. Commerce transits through the air, and a substantial portion of commerce is getting things up and down and passed through the air, but it doesn't stay in the air. You think very differently about a domain that you have a permanent presence in than you think about a domain where you enter and then you exit by default as part of the physics. So for year 2, our students just arrived and we had our orientation yesterday, so I got on a plane after our orientation to come here. They'll be graduating in June 2020. We have 10 Air Force officers this year, a slightly different cadre there. Still an Army space officer and a Sea Service officer, but now we have an international officer coming into the program who's an officer from France. And I think that's also really important to the changing winds of military space, right? The integration, the importance of combined operations, the importance of our coalition partners. The JSPOC has become the CSPOC, and we're moving forward in this more international vein as we go forward. Again, in addition to the regular curriculum, they're going to study space power instead of air power, but this year they're going to choose electives. We've built Space Horizons into the Space Power 1 and Space Power 2 courses so that they will get that as part of the fundamentally important parts of the development of space. As opposed to a course here about the future, it's going to be part of what we're doing right now and what's important for now, not just what's over the horizon. And we'll still take the trips and special events that we did last year. So here's our faculty this year. The only big difference from last year is we've lost, unfortunately, as I mentioned, Pete Garrettson, who retired, and now we have 2 new fellows coming in from last year. And we've got some new electives that are being offered to all of ACSC, and you can see how the number is increasing. The space-focused electives are on one side, from 19 from last year, and then we've added, in addition to those, all the AY20, academic year 20 electives on the right side there. Okay, I see I have only a short amount of time left, so I want to jump to my personal mission in terms of changing the minds of folks in the defense industry about space. This Outer Space Treaty is not your enemy. I try to convey this message pretty much everywhere I go. Dr. Mozer heard me say this and talk about it in a different context in his Space Futures workshop in March. And I talked about this last year in November at New Worlds, specifically with relation to space mining. In this context, I'm going to talk about military uses, because this is the defense panel. So really quickly, I'm going to go through Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, because the best way to grapple with it is to look at the language, right? So the first paragraph of the Outer Space Treaty is the paragraph that deals with all of space, including what I'm calling the void of outer space, right? Not celestial bodies, everything in between. States parties to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. The only restriction in the Outer Space Treaty with regard to the void of outer space, not celestial bodies, has to do with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Doesn't prohibit all nuclear devices, although the Limited Test Ban Treaty may. That's a separate conversation. Paragraph 2 of Article 4 talks about celestial bodies, the rules on restrictions for military uses on celestial bodies, obviously other than Earth. And this is where you get that exclusively peaceful purposes language that people attribute to the entire Outer Space Treaty, that exclusively peaceful purposes applies to all of outer space. And that's not the way the treaty is written. It's written for celestial bodies to be exclusively for peaceful purposes. And even still, you can use military personnel for scientific research or any other peaceful purposes, and any equipment or facility necessary for those peaceful purposes. Think about it. GPS, that was a military endeavor on Earth. There may come a time where we need to have a similar system around the moon so that you can navigate on the moon. Would you want to say that that's not a peaceful purpose to provide that kind of positioning from a military entity on the moon? No. So would that be prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty? No. And I see that my time has elapsed, but I'm happy to talk about any of these issues in further depth if you guys have questions, either while I'm on the panel or if you want to chat with me afterwards. Thank you.
So how much time do we have for questions? Okay, so to not be prescriptive, I'm going to open it up to the audience because you guys have been sitting there for a while, so hit them.
Al Globus, Manager Space Development. Suppose Russia, China, and the United States in some combination had a really serious dust up in orbit, and really, finding at more time levels. Once it's over, how long do you think it would be before LEO was usable again? And do you think it would be, available soon, or it's going to be quite a while?
Well, I personally think quite a while. It depends, of course, on the nature of that dust up and what really happens. But we in the Department of Defense are very sensitive to that. The idea of kinetic warfare in space just scares the bejeebers out of me because of the debris that it puts up. And that basically could deny space for all of humanity for as long as we can think ahead. So that's a real problem. And that's another issue about these large constellations of proliferated LEO. That's another potential second or third order effect. You have all of these things in there. If we start to propagate debris, that's just going to accelerate the problem. So it's a real issue for sure.
Hi. Luke Maloney of NewSpace. To follow on to that question, I'm really curious about is there anything the military is doing specifically to prepare for orbital debris? If there is a dust up, there's going to be a big problem. But even without that, there's already a small problem. Are we going to build some laser brooms? Or something like that?
Well, that's actually an area where my office, chief scientist, we get involved in. And it's not that this is a new problem that we're worrying about, but the attention is being increased quite a bit. So Brigadier General Deanna Burt, who's the head of our operations, she's the fight tonight person, as she would tell you. She's ready to take on an adversary today. That's her job. Has started worrying about these things too, and so this is an area where technology is just going to have to help us out here, and we need to invest in those kind of technologies. That's an area where, frankly, this community may have the technology that we don't have right now, so we need to invest in those and pay attention to it.
And if I could jump in as well, norms of behavior going forward are going to play a huge role in terms of not only the cleanup process of that kind of debris, but also preventing the creation of that kind of debris and preventing the kind of a dust up that our first question asked about. And so there's been a lot of movement in that regard. There were a series of events that happened a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C., where this was a substantial topic of conversation, and the defense side was participating in that conversation along with the rest of government, commerce, NASA, et cetera. And so it's important to focus on that. And personally, I think it's really important for the United States to be engaged in the conversation about setting norms of behavior in space, because if we're not engaged in that conversation, we are going to let others set the parameters for how behavior in space is going to be conducted that may be from a different cultural background, have different values, and that may not represent the values that we want to see of access and use of space for commerce and for all entities and all folks. So, yeah.
Hi. With the new and intense focus on lunar orbit, lunar landing, and all the sort of accoutrements that come along with that, are there any immediate and practical changes to your industries or areas of expertise, new curricula, new partnerships that you need to sort of rush on because this whole new priority?
Well, I guess I would say that a big part of that is the infrastructure that's going to be there. So GPS is an example of that on Earth, right? That was a Air Force military technology that put precision navigation and timing in orbit for military purposes, but very quickly spread to a lot of other applications. And I think the same thing will happen in cislunar space. We need the infrastructure, we need the capabilities that are there, the communications, the surveillance, the protection of assets, all kinds of things. So those are the kinds of technologies and industries that we would be looking forward to from a DoD perspective as we push out to the moon.
Yeah, thanks to the innovative folks already on our faculty at Air Command and Staff College, we've been talking about cislunar space and cislunar development for a long time, but now folks are taking it more seriously when they're hearing it, right? They're seeing that this is something that is going on now. And so I think we've been a little bit ahead of the curve in that sense. So it's not going to be a major change to our curriculum as a result of this, but it may change the way that folks are looking at our curriculum. And there have been space education events being held to try to decide, okay, what does every airman need to know in space? There was an event down in Montgomery at the beginning of June. And so looking at, okay, do we need to have folks understand all the different kinds of operations that are going on, military and non-military, in these areas to have a full understanding of space operations moving forward?
Yeah. And as we've worked with some folks that are working on lunar missions, et cetera, one of the changes is liable to be in the area of communications infrastructure. So while RF is dominant and everything today, we see a lot of things going on in optical in particular, and utilization in that particular context.
You had to rush at the end, so I was wondering if the way you left it means that for the purposes of the Aerospace Treaty, that non-nuclear, non-WMD weapons and military forces not on a surface are permitted by the treaty.
They're not expressly prohibited. And so those norms of behavior that we develop moving forward are going to be really important. But there is no prohibition on non-WMD weapons in the void of outer space. You can't put them on the moon, you can't put them on Mars, but there's no express prohibition on that in outer space from a legal perspective.
And the military forces are fine that
right.
They're not on the surface of it.
Right, so you could not build a military base on the moon and fill it with infantry, but you certainly could, under the language of the Outer Space Treaty, build a space station in orbit and fill it with Space Marines, if you would like to call them that for the sake of discussion.
And of course, one reason you might want to do that is for planetary defense in terms of asteroid collisions.
I had a question for Mr. Faith. I noticed that a lot of the or all of the systems that you listed were land-based. Has there been any consideration of using the marine environment for satellites?
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
So actually, we view ourselves more as a space communications infrastructure company. So not only beyond today, that's dominated by ground stations on the Earth, but we also take a really hard look at LEO to GEO communications and other modes by which you can get data down to the ground.
Dr. Mozer, Air Force Space Command recently did a pretty exciting project on space futures. Could you tell this community a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I owe you $20. So back in March, we had what we called Space Futures Workshop, and this was really to think beyond the horizon. We set our horizon out to the year 2060, and that was to get folks to think beyond the threats and conditions we have in space today and really think about what could the future be, what should the future be, how does it relate to these elements of national power that I talked about. And we had a really good group of folks there, including folks that are in this room today. One of the things we tried to do is create scenarios for the future, realistic scenarios, things that the way that life could play out in the future. And we really came down to asking ourselves 3 questions. The first question was, will there be money to be made in space in the future? Will there be persistent revenue streams? Will there be sustainable wealth generation in space in the future? Second question was, will people, humans, live in or work in space in large numbers? Today we have 6 people that work in space. They're on the International Space Station. But if there were hundreds or thousands of folks, that would be a different situation. And then the third is, who will lead this space development in the future? Is it led by a Western rules-based order or not, or some other entity? And so those 3 questions, if you think of them as yes/no questions, lead to 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 different future scenarios. So you can kind of think through those on your own. You know, the situation where all 3 questions are yes, there's money, yes, there's people, and yes, Western influences lead, we call that the Star Trek future. Where all of them are no, that we call that the dark skies, and there's 6 other permutations of that. The point is, that gives you a construct to think about the future and guide your actions and decisions today to drive us to the futures we want and not go away from the futures that we don't want. Thank you, Peter.
So I got the giant stop sign. Obviously, this is a conversation that, you know, we could have into cocktail hour tonight. So I would encourage you to, in the breaks, to tag up with our panelists, because, you know, especially how Dr. Mozer set the tone for this in terms of power and thinking out in the future. We've got a lot of tactical challenges, you know, as the Air Force Corporation is responsible for advising the Air Force and the NRO on, you know, contested space. But Dr. Mozer is very, very pointed in this point of saying that we've also got to think about out in the future and where are we going and how do we prepare for what we're going to be seeing in the future in terms of contested space. So I encourage you to touch base with them throughout the conference and continue this conversation. And can we just thank our panel?